In the shadow of Egypt's ancient pyramids, beneath the shifting sands and hidden beneath the layers of time, a forgotten story waits to be uncovered. Imagine a time 12,000 years ago, long before the first pharaohs united Upper and Lower Egypt, when the land was ruled not by kings, but by gods. The very concept of what it means to be a pharaoh, a ruler of the Nile, begins with a figure whose reign defies history, a figure whose legacy was erased by the passage of time and the tides of power. Before the rise of the dynasties, there was one who stood as the first pharaoh of the gods, a god-king whose reign spanned over 12,000 years. This figure, this divine ruler, was far beyond human understanding. Yet his influence was the foundation upon which Egypt's later rulers built their power. Today we explore the truth behind this legend, a story that intertwines myth, forgotten history, and cosmic forces, leading us to a time when Egypt itself had not yet risen, but was already being shaped by a mysterious and powerful hand. But before we embark on this journey, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment below. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. Your support fuels these deep dives, and I'm grateful to have you here. Now let's uncover the forgotten history of the first pharaoh of the gods, a figure whose reign lasted beyond our wildest imagination. The story begins with a single concept: the god-king, a ruler who was more than human, more than divine, yet somehow both. Ancient Egyptian texts, both recorded in stone and whispered through generations, speak of a time before the pharaohs, the first pharaoh of the gods, a title that echoes through the annals of Egypt's ancient past. But this figure wasn't just a man who claimed divinity. No, he was said to be born of the gods themselves, an immortal leader who transcended the boundaries of time, a figure whose reign was marked not by the physical, but by the celestial. But why, you may ask, is this ruler lost to history? Why have the names of the first gods of Egypt been obscured, buried beneath the layers of sand and mystery? Perhaps the answer lies in the flood of time itself, an era so ancient, so far removed from us, that the records of such a reign have been erased, intentionally or by the inevitable forces of nature. The ancient Egyptians were not the first civilization to recognize the stars as their divine guides. They knew, as we know now, that the cosmos above them held the keys to power, to understanding, and to creation. The gods they worshipped were not just symbolic figures, they were celestial beings, immortal and beyond the understanding of mortal men. They came from the heavens, and their reign on earth was just a reflection of the power they wielded in the stars. But who was this first pharaoh of the gods? Who was this god-king who ruled a land that had not yet been named Egypt, a land that was only just beginning to understand the power of the Nile? The answer, it seems, lies in a name whispered in ancient texts: Horus, the hawk-headed god of kingship and the sky. Known to later Egyptians as the embodiment of pharaohs, Horus was once said to have ruled the earth before any human had ever stepped onto its soil. Scholars debate the origins of Horus. Was he a god born of the heavens, or was he a king whose mythic rise inspired the gods themselves? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Some suggest that Horus was not merely a god, but the first of the god-kings, a being whose reign spanned millennia and whose story was carried by the stars themselves. The Egyptians believed that Horus, as the god of the sky, watched over the land from above, ensuring the balance of life on earth. His reign was marked by cosmic order, and as the ruler of the skies, he was the protector of all that was sacred. The idea of a 12,000-year reign seems impossible by modern standards, but when we consider the ancient Egyptian belief in the cyclical nature of time, it begins to make sense. The Egyptians saw time as a vast, infinite river, and within that river, the gods and their influence flowed endlessly. It was not a linear progression, but a constant return where the gods and their kings ruled in cycles. Horus, then, was not a mere mortal who lived and died, but a divine being whose reign would never truly end. As we explore the nature of this god-king's reign, we must ask, what did his rule mean for the land of Egypt before it even became Egypt? What was the true legacy left behind by Horus, a figure whose name would eventually become synonymous with the pharaohs who followed? Was there a time when Egypt itself was not just a kingdom, but a divine construct, ruled by gods, influenced by the heavens, and shaped by an ancient celestial power? In the next part of our journey, we will explore the nature of Horus's reign and how it laid the foundation for Egypt's greatest achievements. But first, let's dive into the mythology that surrounds him, myths that trace their origins to a time long before Egypt's first dynasties, and which speak of a kingdom not of this earth, but of the stars. As we journey further into the myths surrounding Horus, we discover that his reign was not simply one of earthly dominion, but a cosmic rule. He wasn't just the first king of Egypt, but the first to represent the union between the heavens and the earth. His reign, stretching across an unfathomable 12,000 years, was marked by an unwavering connection to the celestial bodies above. The Egyptians saw the stars not just as distant lights in the sky, but as divine entities, the homes of gods, and the guides for their kings. For Horus, his connection to the sky was not a metaphor, it was the very foundation of his power. The mythological tales of Horus are rich with symbolism and meaning. One of the most famous stories recounts the battle between Horus and his uncle Set, the god of chaos and disorder. This battle, which raged for years, symbolized the eternal struggle between order and chaos, light and darkness, creation and destruction. It wasn't just a family feud, it was a cosmic conflict, one that mirrored the forces of the universe themselves. Set, as the embodiment of chaos, represented the forces that sought to undo creation, to unravel the divine order established by Horus and the gods. Horus, in turn, was the champion of order, the protector of the cosmic balance. This battle was not merely a struggle for the throne of Egypt, it was a struggle for control of the universe itself. And in this contest, Horus was not merely defending his birthright as a king, but his divine nature as a god-king. His triumph over Set symbolized the restoration of cosmic order, the preservation of harmony in the heavens and on earth. But this victory came at a cost. Horus lost an eye in the battle, a symbolic sacrifice that would come to represent the god's wisdom and insight. The eye of Horus, as it became known, would later be seen as a symbol of protection, healing, and divine insight. But what does this ancient myth tell us about the first pharaoh of the gods? Beyond the celestial battle, it offers a glimpse into the nature of Horus's reign. His leadership was not just about earthly authority, it was about cosmic responsibility. The gods of Egypt were not distant figures, but active forces that shaped the very fabric of reality. To be a pharaoh, then, was not merely to rule a land, it was to uphold the order of the cosmos itself. This cosmic responsibility is echoed in the role of the pharaohs who followed Horus. The later rulers of Egypt would see themselves not as mere men, but as living gods, chosen by the gods themselves to maintain balance and harmony. They wore the crown of Horus, a symbol of their divine right to rule. The pharaohs were seen as the earthly embodiment of Horus, and their reigns were considered a continuation of the god-king's divine rule. But while Horus's reign was marked by divine order, it was also marked by divine intervention. The gods of Egypt did not sit idly by while their chosen king ruled. They were active, participants in the affairs of the world, guiding, protecting, and sometimes punishing their rulers. The gods would intervene directly in the lives of the pharaohs, offering their wisdom and guidance, but also testing their worthiness to rule. This divine involvement in earthly matters is central to the concept of kingship in ancient Egypt. To be a pharaoh was to be chosen by the gods, but it was also to be under their scrutiny. The gods would not allow their kings to rule recklessly, and they would not tolerate injustice or corruption. This concept of divine kingship was so ingrained in Egyptian culture that it shaped their entire worldview. The pharaohs were not seen as above the law, but as the enforcers of divine law. They were the living embodiments of the gods' will on earth, and their actions were seen as divinely sanctioned. This belief gave the pharaohs their unmatched power, but it also placed them under an immense burden. They were not just rulers, they were the protectors of the cosmic order. In exploring the role of Horus as the first pharaoh of the gods, we begin to see how the pharaoh's connection to the divine influenced every aspect of Egyptian life. The temples, the pyramids, the tombs, they were all designed to honor the gods and to ensure that the cosmic order was upheld. The grandeur of Egypt's architecture and the precision of its engineering were not just feats of human achievement. They were divine acts made possible by the gods themselves. But Horus's legacy did not end with his reign. His influence extended far beyond his divine rule. The very idea of the god-king was passed down through the ages, and later rulers would strive to live up to the ideal set by Horus. The concept of divine kingship became the cornerstone of Egyptian civilization. It was not just a political system, it was a religious system, a belief that the pharaohs were the intermediaries between the gods and the people, responsible for maintaining the balance between the heavens and the earth. As we continue to explore the origins of the first pharaoh of the gods, we must ask ourselves, what legacy did Horus leave behind? Was it a divine right to rule, passed down through the generations, or was it something more? Was Horus's reign a model for the future, a guide for the pharaohs who would follow? And what of the gods themselves? What role did they play in the shaping of Egypt, and how did their influence extend beyond the time of Horus? In the next part of our journey, we will dive deeper into the divine legacy of Horus and the ways in which his reign set the stage for the rise of Egypt's greatest pharaohs. We will explore the connection between the god-king and the rise of Egypt as a superpower, examining the way Horus's influence can still be seen in the grand monuments of Egypt's golden age. The legacy of Horus stretches far beyond his divine reign as the first pharaoh of the gods. As we move further through the annals of Egypt's history, we see that his influence is embedded in every aspect of Egyptian civilization. From the architecture to the philosophy, from the very structure of the state to the divine practices that guided daily life, Horus's reign set the precedent for the pharaohs who would come after him. The pharaohs who followed Horus saw themselves as direct heirs to his divine rule, entrusted with the cosmic responsibility of maintaining balance between the realms of gods and men. This connection to Horus was not a mere symbolic gesture. It was the very foundation of their kingship. It was said that each new pharaoh was the living Horus, the embodiment of the god on earth. In this way, the kings of Egypt were not just rulers. They were intermediaries between the divine and the mortal, a sacred connection that gave them unparalleled authority. This divine connection was not just theoretical, it was reinforced in the actions of the pharaohs. They performed rituals and sacrifices to honor the gods, ensuring that the cosmic balance was upheld. The construction of temples and monuments was not just an act of personal glory, but a direct offering to the gods, an effort to sustain the divine favor that kept the natural world in harmony. The pyramids themselves, with their immense scale and precision, were designed to reflect the eternal connection between the pharaohs and the gods. They were not mere tombs, they were divine vessels, designed to carry the soul of the pharaoh into the afterlife, where he would continue his reign alongside the gods. The divine nature of the pharaoh's rule was most clearly demonstrated in the role of the high priest of Amun, who wielded immense power alongside the king. The priesthood acted as the earthly counterpart to the gods, guiding the spiritual and religious practices of the people. The relationship between the pharaoh and the priesthood was symbiotic. Each needed the other to maintain the balance of power. While the pharaoh provided the authority and military might to defend Egypt, the priests provided the spiritual guidance that ensured the gods were pleased and Egypt remained prosperous. The divine right to rule, as set by Horus, was further cemented in the Horus name, a title taken by every pharaoh after him. This name was not simply a title, it was a declaration of the king's divine mandate. It symbolized the ruler's connection to Horus, his role as the protector of Egypt, and his responsibility to maintain cosmic order. The Horus name was used in conjunction with the pharaoh's birth name and throne name, further underscoring the divine authority that underpinned their rule. The early dynasties of Egypt, therefore, were not just political entities, they were the spiritual successors to Horus's divine reign. Their reigns were guided by the gods, their actions dictated by the need to maintain the divine order. The pharaohs were not simply men. They were gods in human form, charged with the responsibility to ensure that the cosmic balance was upheld for all eternity. But the influence of Horus didn't just stop with the kings. His legacy was also reflected in the daily lives of the Egyptians. The people of Egypt believed that their prosperity and well-being were directly tied to the actions of the pharaoh. If the king upheld his divine duties, Egypt would thrive. If he failed in his role, the consequences could be catastrophic, bringing chaos, famine, and even natural disasters. This idea of divine justice was central to Egyptian belief, and it reinforced the bond between the people and their rulers. The central role of the pharaoh in maintaining order was reflected in the laws of Egypt. The Ma'at, the divine principle of truth, balance, and order, was the foundation of Egyptian law. It was believed that the pharaoh was the living embodiment of Ma'at, and it was his duty to uphold its tenets. The pharaoh's actions were measured against the concept of Ma'at, ensuring that justice and fairness were maintained. One of the most powerful symbols of Horus's divine influence is the Djed pillar, a representation of stability and immortality that was associated with the god Osiris, Horus's father. The Djed was a symbol of the backbone, and it came to represent the eternal stability of Egypt itself. It was often depicted in the funerary context, used in rituals to ensure that the pharaoh would continue to rule in the afterlife. The Djed pillar was a symbol of the pharaoh's connection to both Horus and Osiris, a link between the living king and the eternal gods. As we delve deeper into Egypt's early dynasties, we see that Horus's divine rule was not just a spiritual concept, but an enduring reality that shaped the very fabric of Egyptian life. The first pharaohs were the living gods, entrusted with the task of ensuring the continuation of the divine order. They were the protectors of Ma'at, the embodiment of cosmic balance, and their reigns were seen as the guarantors of Egypt's prosperity. But as we know, every empire must face its challenges, and even the divine kings of Egypt were not immune to the forces of time. As we move forward in Egypt's history, we will begin to see how the divine legacy of Horus, while unshakable, would eventually be tested by internal and external forces. In the coming parts, we will explore how the pharaoh's connection to Horus and the gods shaped their reigns, their decisions, and their eventual downfall. As the centuries passed, Egypt continued to flourish under the divine rule of its pharaohs, each one a living embodiment of Horus. The divine kingship, rooted in the reign of Horus, held Egypt together as the kings navigated both earthly and divine duties. However, as all civilizations must, Egypt eventually faced pressures that tested the very foundation of its belief system. Internal strife, shifting alliances, and the challenges of maintaining an empire that spanned vast territories all began to erode the unshakable power of the pharaohs. By the time of the Old Kingdom, the royal family and its connection to the gods became so deeply entrenched that even the smallest of missteps by the pharaoh could cause unrest throughout the land. The people of Egypt had been raised with the understanding that their prosperity was tied directly to the ruler's divine favor. When the gods appeared to withdraw that favor, the consequences could be devastating. One of the most telling moments of this shift came during the reign of Pharaoh Djoser, one of the earliest and most powerful kings of the Third Dynasty. Under his rule, Egypt's first true pyramid was constructed, the Step Pyramid of Saqqara. This monumental structure, created by the visionary architect Imhotep, was more than just a tomb. It was a symbol of the eternal connection between the pharaoh and the gods. The pyramid itself was designed to elevate the pharaoh to the heavens, ensuring that his divine spirit would ascend to join the gods after his death. However, Djoser's reign was not without its own challenges. Internal corruption, along with growing unrest among the people, began to threaten the stability of the kingdom. The continued construction of monumental projects like the pyramids, while impressive, placed a tremendous strain on the economy and the common people. The divine right of kings was challenged not by external enemies, but by the very people whom the pharaohs ruled. The people began to question whether the pharaoh could still fulfill his sacred duty to maintain Ma'at, the divine order that ensured their survival. This growing tension would culminate in one of the most significant moments of Egypt's ancient history, the First Intermediate Period. After a series of weak rulers, Egypt fell into a state of political fragmentation and economic instability. The central authority of the pharaoh was undermined, and for a time the land was divided between competing factions. This period saw Egypt splinter, with different regions falling under the control of local leaders, who in many cases no longer acknowledged the divine kingship of the pharaoh. The collapse of the centralized divine rule threatened to destabilize everything the ancient Egyptians had built. Yet as the chaos of the First Intermediate Period unfolded, something remarkable began to happen. The myth of Horus, far from fading into oblivion, began to reassert itself in a new form. The old divine connection between the pharaoh and the gods was revitalized by the rise of new, powerful leaders who claimed a direct connection to the gods. These rulers sought to prove that they, too, were worthy of the divine right to rule. One of the most notable figures of this era was Mentuhotep II, the founder of the Middle Kingdom. His rise to power was seen as a direct rebirth of Horus's divine kingship, an act of cosmic reordering after the collapse of the Old Kingdom. Mentuhotep's rule marked the reunification of Egypt and the return of the central authority of the pharaoh. He wasn't just a ruler, he was the living embodiment of the cosmic order, a direct connection to Horus. Under his reign, Egypt flourished once more, as he oversaw the restoration of temples, the construction of monumental buildings, and the revival of trade with neighboring regions. The reunification of Egypt under Mentuhotep II was a clear reaffirmation of Horus's divine influence on the throne. The concept of the living Horus was revived, and the legitimacy of the pharaohs was restored by invoking the power of the gods. This revitalization of the divine kingship was not merely a return to the old ways, it was a reassertion of divine order over the forces of chaos that had threatened to tear Egypt apart. As Egypt entered the Middle Kingdom, a new philosophy began to take shape. The focus shifted from the grandeur of the pharaoh as a god-king to a more personal, introspective connection to the divine. The concept of Ma'at was not only about the pharaoh maintaining balance in the world, but also about the people living in harmony with divine order. The gods were no longer distant and unreachable, but were seen as accessible and present in the daily lives of the Egyptians. Despite the stability restored by Mentuhotep, Egypt continued to face challenges. The divine authority of the pharaohs was no longer unquestioned. The people began to demand more from their rulers, not just in terms of military victories and economic prosperity, but in their ability to maintain spiritual order and balance. As Egypt's power grew, so too did the expectations placed upon the pharaoh. The rise of Amenemhat Wando, the founder of the 12th dynasty, exemplified this new era of divine kingship. His reign was marked by a renewed focus on the spiritual responsibilities of the king. His royal decrees often emphasized the pharaoh's role as the living Horus, a divine intermediary whose duty was to ensure that both the physical and spiritual well-being of Egypt were maintained. The temples and monuments constructed during his reign reflected this shift, with more emphasis on personal piety and connection to the gods, rather than just grand displays of royal power. This era also saw the development of the wisdom literature that would define much of Egyptian philosophy in the centuries to come. The instructions of Ptahhotep and the maxims of Ani emphasized the importance of moral behavior, social order, and respect for the divine. These texts, while not directly linked to the reign of any specific pharaoh, were a reflection of the evolving spiritual landscape of Egypt, a landscape shaped by the enduring legacy of Horus. Yet despite this spiritual renewal, the forces of chaos were always lurking. The idea of divine kingship, while still powerful, was being tested in new ways. As Egypt's external borders expanded, the divine kingship was often challenged by the external enemies of Egypt, other kingdoms and peoples who did not recognize the divine right of the pharaohs. The power of Horus as the foundation of kingship would soon be tested once more. As the new kingdom approached and Egypt entered a period of unprecedented military expansion, the divine authority of the pharaohs would become more entwined with their military might, as the role of the king evolved from a purely spiritual leader to a conqueror of lands. As the new kingdom dawned, Egypt entered its most powerful and prosperous era. It was during this period that the pharaohs would solidify their status as both divine kings and military conquerors. The divine right to rule, once a symbol of cosmic order and spiritual responsibility, would now be directly linked to their ability to expand Egypt's empire through military might. This shift would forever alter the very nature of divine kingship in Egypt, merging the idea of the pharaoh as the god on earth with that of a conqueror who could shape the very borders of the known world. The first of these truly military pharaohs was Thutmose III, who reigned during the 18th dynasty. His reign marked a clear departure from the old, more peaceful kingship of previous dynasties. He led several military campaigns into the Levant and Nubia, greatly expanding Egypt's territory. These conquests were not just about increasing the size of the empire, but about establishing the pharaoh's authority over the foreign gods and peoples that inhabited these lands. By defeating foreign kings, Thutmose IV was asserting the dominance of the Egyptian gods, particularly Horus, over all other divine forces. The most dramatic manifestation of the divine kingship during this period came with the reign of Thutmose III, the Napoleon of Egypt. Thutmose III was a master tactician who launched over 17 military campaigns in the Levant and Syria, securing Egypt's supremacy over the region for decades. His military prowess was not just a tool of conquest, it was a divine act. By defeating his enemies, Thutmose III was seen as enacting the will of the gods, especially Horus, who watched over him in battle. The conquests were celebrated as divine victories, reinforcing the belief that the pharaoh was the living embodiment of Horus's divine might. However, Thutmose III's reign also marked the beginning of a shift in the way the gods were perceived. While earlier pharaohs had seen themselves as direct embodiments of Horus, the pharaohs of the new kingdom began to focus more on their role as intermediaries between the gods and the people. The connection between the king and the gods remained crucial, but the nature of that connection began to change. Pharaohs like Thutmose III were not only warriors, they were also priests, responsible for maintaining the favor of the gods through rituals, offerings, and the construction of temples. The most famous of these priest kings was Akhenaten, a pharaoh whose reign would become one of the most controversial in Egyptian history. Akhenaten's attempt to revolutionize Egypt's religious practices by shifting from the traditional pantheon of gods to the worship of a single deity, Aten, was a radical departure from centuries of tradition. His vision was one of an all-encompassing solar deity, the Aten, that would be worshipped above all others. For Akhenaten, the pharaoh was no longer the living Horus, but the sole intermediary between the Aten and the people, The reforms of Akhenaten were short-lived, and after his death, the return to the old gods was swift. The restoration of the traditional religious practices under his successors, including Tutankhamun, reaffirmed the old belief system that the pharaoh was not only the political and military leader of Egypt, but also the living representative of Horus, ensuring the cosmic order and the stability of the kingdom. Yet, as Egypt moved into the later periods of its history, the divine kingship began to lose its former power. The political and military challenges Egypt faced were compounded by the internal strife within the royal family and the growing influence of the priesthood. No longer were the pharaohs seen as untouchable gods who ruled with absolute authority. They were instead seen as men who were capable of both great acts of wisdom and folly, subject to the same forces that governed the lives of ordinary Egyptians. One of the most significant moments in this transition came during the reign of Ramesses II, perhaps the greatest of the New Kingdom pharaohs. Ramesses II, or Ramesses the Great, ruled for an unprecedented 66 years, overseeing a period of military expansion, monumental construction, and religious devotion. His military campaigns, particularly the Battle of Kadesh, were celebrated as divine victories, with Ramesses positioning himself as the earthly representative of Horus, leading his armies to triumph over his enemies. His divine status was reinforced through the construction of colossal temples and monuments, such as those at Abu Simbel, where his image was carved into the mountainside as a constant reminder of his divine kingship. Yet despite his overwhelming power and influence, Ramesses II was not immune to the changes occurring in Egypt. His reign, while marked by external victories, also saw the gradual erosion of the pharaoh's absolute authority. The rise of the priesthood, particularly the powerful cult of Amun, began to overshadow the royal family's control over Egypt's religious practices. The pharaoh, once the central figure of divine rule, was increasingly viewed as a figurehead, with the high priests of Amun wielding considerable influence over the kingdom's spiritual and political affairs. This shift in power dynamics foreshadowed the eventual decline of the new kingdom and the rise of external forces that would threaten Egypt's divine kingship. The invasions of the Sea Peoples, the weakening of the royal family, and the rise of foreign powers, including the Persians and later the Greeks, would ultimately spell the end of the divine rule of the pharaohs. Egypt's once immense empire crumbled, and the gods of Egypt, including Horus, were no longer the guiding forces of the land. The last pharaoh to hold the mantle of divine kingship was Cleopatra VII, whose reign marked the final chapter in the history of Egypt as an independent kingdom. Although she ruled with great political and diplomatic skill, the power of the pharaohs had long since been eclipsed by the influence of Rome. Cleopatra's connection to the gods, especially her claim to divine descent through the Ptolemaic dynasty, was no longer enough to protect Egypt from the encroaching forces of empire. Her tragic end, alongside the fall of Egypt to the Romans, symbolized the end of the divine kingship that had ruled the land for over 3,000 years. As Egypt's divine kingship crumbled, the echoes of the ancient pharaohs still resonated in the hearts of the people. Though the temples fell into ruin, the stories of the gods and kings remained, passed down through generations, etched into the stones and written on papyri, becoming legends that would transcend Egypt's borders. The ancient Egyptian vision of kingship, where the ruler was both a god on earth and the protector of cosmic order, lived on in a different form, no longer as a political system, but as a spiritual and cultural inheritance. Even under Roman rule, Egypt's grandeur continued to captivate the world. The Roman emperors who controlled the Nile Valley found themselves drawn to Egypt's mystique, particularly its rich religious history. The Roman fascination with Egypt's divine monarchy was not just about power. It was about understanding the gods, the cosmic order, and the mysteries that had made Egypt so unique. The Egyptian temples were not simply places of worship, but living embodiments of a civilization that had mastered the delicate balance between the material and the divine. Rome's emperors, particularly during the reigns of Augustus and later emperors like Hadrian, would adopt the titles of pharaohs, invoking Egypt's regal imagery in an attempt to harness the divine legitimacy that had long been associated with the pharaohs. Egypt, once the cradle of civilization, was now under the thumb of imperial Rome, but the divine idea of kingship that had begun thousands of years before would continue to influence rulers, philosophers, and even the development of Western religious thought. During this period, Egypt's rich symbolism would seep into Greco-Roman culture. Roman emperors began to appropriate Egyptian religious symbols for their own purposes. The iconic obelisks, symbols of the sun god Ra, were transported to Rome and placed in the heart of the city. These monuments, once the markers of divine kingship, now stood as reminders of a lost world, of a civilization that once ruled over the known world with divine authority. Even the Egyptian gods, once fiercely independent in their pantheons, were reinterpreted in Roman temples and courts. Yet as the centuries passed, the connection between the Egyptian pharaohs and the gods they represented would begin to fade. Christianity, which had spread across the Roman Empire, would shift the focus of divine kingship from the pharaohs of Egypt to the Christian God and the divine right of kings. The idea of a human ruler as a living God, a divine intermediary between the heavens and earth, was no longer tenable in the new religious and political climate. Egypt's influence on the concept of kingship would be replaced by the idea of a single, omnipotent God, and the role of the ruler would shift from a divine monarch to a steward of divine will. But despite the political and religious transformations, the legacy of Egypt's divine kingship continued to influence the world in subtle and profound ways. The very idea of divine kingship would reappear throughout history, albeit in different forms. From the emperors of China, who were seen as the son of heaven, to the European monarchs who claimed the divine right to rule, the concept of kingship tied to divine legitimacy would persist as a cornerstone of royal authority. And then, in the modern world, the myth of Egypt's divine kingship resurfaced with the discovery of tombs, temples, and artifacts that had been buried for centuries. Archaeologists, fascinated by the grandeur of ancient Egypt, unearthed the remains of the great pharaohs, sparking a resurgence of interest in their reigns and the mythology surrounding them. From the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in the early 20th century to the vast and awe-inspiring temples of Luxor and Karnak, Egypt's gods and kings once again captured the imagination of people across the globe. In the 21st century, Egypt continues to be a source of inspiration for artists, writers, and scholars alike. The divine kingship of the pharaohs remains a powerful symbol of humanity's search for meaning, power, and connection with the divine. The pyramids, the Sphinx, and the ancient temples stand as silent witnesses to a past that continues to speak to us, urging us to uncover the mysteries of the gods who once walked the earth in the bodies of their rulers. As modern archaeologists dig deeper into Egypt's past, new layers of history are uncovered, each discovery adding more complexity to the story of the divine kingship that once reigned supreme over the Nile Valley. Every new artifact, every piece of papyrus, offers a glimpse into a world where gods and kings were one, and where the fate of humanity was intertwined with the divine order. Yet the true nature of this divine monarchy remains elusive, shrouded in the mists of time and mystery. One of the most remarkable finds in recent years has been the discovery of a series of ancient inscriptions and texts that challenge the conventional understanding of Egypt's early rulers. These texts, some of which date back to the pre-dynastic period, reveal a fascinating portrait of a time when Egypt was still emerging from the primordial chaos and the gods were directly involved in the formation of the state. The more these inscriptions are analyzed, the clearer it becomes that the first pharaohs were not merely kings, but intermediaries between the heavens and earth, chosen by the gods themselves to establish order in the world. This divine mandate is evident in the title of Pharaoh, which, when translated, means great house, symbolizing the ruler as the abode of the divine on earth. It's a title that speaks not only of political power, but also of the king's sacred role as the earthly representative of the gods. The pharaoh's connection to the gods was not just a matter of ritual or symbolism, it was a fundamental part of their identity, a divine essence that flowed through their bloodline. This divine kingship was not confined to the pharaoh alone. The entire royal family, from the queen consort to the royal children, were seen as having a special connection to the gods. They were believed to be imbued with divine power, and their very presence in the royal court was thought to maintain cosmic order. Even the architecture of the royal palace was designed to reflect the heavens, with hieroglyphs and symbols of the gods adorning every wall, every door, every pillar. For the ancient Egyptians, the divine kingship was more than just a political system. It was the foundation of their entire worldview. It was through the pharaoh's rule that Mahat, the cosmic order, was maintained. The pharaoh was the guarantor of balance, the one who ensured that the forces of chaos did not overwhelm the world. Without the pharaoh's divine guidance, the very fabric of society would unravel, and the earth would fall into darkness and disorder. This is why the pharaohs were so deeply revered, and why their death was such a profound event. Upon the death of the pharaoh, the cosmic order was at risk, and it was through elaborate rituals and ceremonies that the king's soul was preserved, and his divine essence passed on to the next ruler. This idea of divine kingship, though deeply rooted in Egypt's religious system, was not unique to the Nile Valley. Other ancient civilizations, such as Mesopotamia and China, had their own versions of rulers who were believed to have a divine connection. However, what set Egypt apart was the sheer longevity and consistency of its divine monarchy. For over 3,000 years, Egypt was ruled by a succession of pharaohs, each one embodying the same divine principles established by the first rulers. It was this continuity that allowed Egypt to become one of the most stable and enduring civilizations in history, a civilization whose influence can still be felt today. And while the concept of divine kingship in Egypt eventually faded with the rise of Christianity and Islam, its legacy remains. The idea that a ruler can hold divine power continues to resonate in modern politics, where the divine right of kings has been replaced by the idea of political legitimacy granted by the people. Yet even in democratic systems, the concept of divine authority still lingers, manifested in the charisma and power that leaders wield, often seen as above reproach and invested with a sense of destiny. The lessons of ancient Egypt, especially the story of the first pharaohs, offer us a unique perspective on the nature of power, leadership, and the relationship between humanity and the divine. It is a story that teaches us about the complexity of civilization, the fragility of order, and the eternal search for meaning in a chaotic world. In the modern era, Egypt's past continues to inspire countless scholars, artists, and filmmakers. The ancient monuments, the tombs of the pharaohs, the grand pyramids that still stand as the last remaining wonders of the ancient world, all serve as reminders of a civilization that once believed in the divine right of kings to rule over both the heavens and the earth. These monuments are not just the physical remains of a long-gone society. They are the symbols of a belief system that placed the pharaoh at the center of creation itself. They remind us that, while the rulers of ancient Egypt may have faded into the sands of time, their influence on our understanding of kingship, divinity, and power continues to shape the world we live in today. As we stand in awe before the great pyramids of Giza, the temples of Luxor, and the towering obelisks scattered across the Nile Valley, it's impossible to ignore the profound legacy of the divine pharaohs. These colossal monuments are not just architectural feats. They are the physical manifestations of a once flourishing belief system that elevated the ruler to a godlike status. And while much of the grandeur of ancient Egypt may have faded with time, one question continues to echo across the ages. How did the first pharaohs, those divine rulers, leave such an indelible mark on the course of human history? The answer lies not only in their political and religious systems, but in the remarkable advancements they fostered. The divine pharaohs of Egypt were not just gods in human form, they were also the masterminds behind some of the earliest and most groundbreaking achievements in human civilization. From the art of writing to the development of complex mathematics, their reigns laid the foundations for a culture that would influence every civilization that came after it. One of the most enduring legacies of the first pharaohs is the development of hieroglyphs, the sacred script that would become synonymous with ancient Egypt. It was through the invention of this intricate writing system that the Egyptians were able to record not only their royal decrees, but also the myths, religious beliefs, and knowledge of their time. These texts, written on papyrus scrolls and inscribed on the walls of tombs and temples, have provided modern scholars with invaluable insights into the inner workings of Egyptian society. The religious texts, in particular, are a window into the minds of the pharaohs and their divine connections. They reveal a complex pantheon of gods and goddesses, each with their own domains and roles within the cosmic order. At the apex of this hierarchy stood the sun, god Ra, the ultimate deity associated with creation, light, and life. The pharaoh, as Ra's earthly representative, was seen as the keeper of Ma'at, the divine principle of balance and order. To the ancient Egyptians, the pharaoh's role was not just political, but cosmic, ensuring that the forces of chaos never encroached upon the ordered world of the gods. Another critical aspect of the pharaoh's power was his role in the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that death was not the end, but rather a transition into another realm. The pharaoh, as a divine being, was thought to ascend to the heavens upon death, joining the gods in eternal life. The grand tombs and pyramids that housed the pharaohs were not just tombs, they were the king's journey to immortality. These tombs were filled with treasures, statues, and intricate paintings, all designed to ensure that the pharaoh's soul would live on forever in the afterlife. The sheer scale and ambition of these tombs reflect the immense power and divine status the pharaohs held in life and death. However, as the centuries passed, Egypt's religious and political landscape began to shift. New rulers emerged, and the divine kingship of the pharaohs gradually evolved. While the idea of divine monarchy remained at the heart of Egypt's royal system, the role of the pharaoh became more symbolic, and the direct connection to the gods became less tangible. By the time of the New Kingdom, pharaohs such as Akhenaten and Tutankhamun had begun to experiment with religious reform, challenging the old pantheon of gods and introducing new ideas. But despite these changes, the influence of the first pharaohs never truly disappeared. The monuments they built, the religious traditions they established, and the governance system they created continued to shape Egyptian culture for centuries. Even as Egypt's dynasties crumbled, the memory of the first divine pharaohs lived on, both in the written record and in the collective imagination of their descendants. In fact, the image of the pharaoh as a living god became so ingrained in Egyptian culture that it survived well into the Hellenistic and Roman periods. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, he was hailed as a divine ruler, and subsequent Greek and Roman rulers, including the Ptolemaic dynasty, would embrace the concept of pharaohship, modeling their own reigns after the gods of Egypt. The legacy of the divine pharaohs also had a lasting impact on later civilizations. In particular, their sophisticated understanding of governance, religion, and architecture influenced cultures across the Mediterranean and the Near East. From the Greeks to the Romans, from the Persians to the Israelites, Egypt's enduring presence as a symbol of divine monarchy served as both a model and a cautionary tale. And as we look back at the ancient Egyptian world, we cannot help but wonder what might have been. What if the first pharaohs had continued their reign for another millennia? What new advancements in science, mathematics, and culture might they have achieved? What further mysteries about the gods and the cosmos might they have uncovered? In the end, the story of the first pharaohs is one that transcends time. It is a story of power, divinity, and the quest for immortality. It is a story that continues to captivate and inspire us as we seek to understand the mysteries of the past and the complex relationship between humanity and the divine. The pharaohs of Egypt may be gone, but their legacy, woven into the very fabric of human history, remains as enduring as the pyramids that still rise above the sands of the desert. And so, as we conclude our journey through the reign of Egypt's first divine pharaoh, we are left with more questions than answers. The legacy of these extraordinary rulers, their divine power, and their monumental achievements continue to shape our understanding of human history. What other secrets lie buried beneath the sands of time? What other lost civilizations wait to be uncovered? As always, thank you for joining us on this incredible journey into the ancient world. If you've enjoyed exploring these mysteries with us, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. What do you think of these ancient rulers and their divine legacy? We love hearing from you and look forward to bringing you even more deep dives into the forgotten chapters of history.